Tokyo, Japan, April 1972. The Budokan Arena on a championship night is something different from any other sporting venue in Japan. The building itself carries weight, not just from the architecture, which is significant, but from what the building means to the Japanese sporting community, and specifically to the martial arts community that treats it as something close to sacred ground. Judo was born in Japan, and the Budokan is where Japan watches Judo at its highest level, and the crowd that fills it on nights like this one understands what they are watching in the specific way that only serious practitioners can understand it. 6,000 people, every seat full. The particular quality of focus that a judo crowd brings to a championship final, which is different from the energy of boxing crowds or wrestling crowds, quieter and more intense, the focused attention of people who have trained enough to see what is happening beneath the surface of what is happening. Bruce Lee is in the front row. He is here because the Japan Martial Arts Federation invited him as an honored guest for the Women's Judo World Championship, and because someone on the organizing committee who had seen the big boss understood that his presence would mean something to the event and arranged the invitation through a mutual contact. He had arrived in Tokyo 2 days earlier for film meetings, and the timing aligned. He is not announced. A portion of the crowd near the front row has recognized him across the evening, recognition moving in its usual quiet wave, but officially, he is simply a guest in an excellent seat, watching championship judo. He has been watching with the quality of attention he always brought to serious fighting, building a picture from what he observed rather than registering isolated moments. Judo was not a discipline he had studied formally, but he had spent time with it, trained against judoka, understood its principles, and what he was watching tonight was the finest judo he had seen applied in competition. The woman who won tonight's championship was the finest practitioner of it. Her name was Yamamoto Ko. She was 28 years old, born in Osaka, training in judo since she was 7, which meant 21 years of practice. The Japanese sporting press covered her with the reverence reserved for athletes who had transcended being competitive and become something like definitional, the person whose name you used when you wanted to explain what excellence in the discipline looked like. Her record was 61 wins, 3 losses, all 3 losses in the first 3 years of her career, 58 consecutive wins since, the last 12 at championship level. She was 5'6" and 168 pounds, of the specific kind of physical capability that judo produces in a person's body, across 2 decades, the strength built into the hips and legs and core that generates throwing power, the grip strength that makes the initial contact decisive, the balance so deeply conditioned that it operated below conscious thought. Tonight's final had been against a French competitor who was genuinely excellent and who had made Yamamoto work harder than anyone else in the tournament. The French competitor had survived 2 throws that would have ended most matches, which said something real about her resilience, and had made Yamamoto modify her approach twice in the second period, which said something real about her quality. Yamamoto had won on Ippon in the final 20 seconds, a perfect throw that the crowd received with the specific sound of people who understand excellence, making contact with it directly. The trophy presentation was handled by the Federation chairman, who said several things in Japanese about the evening, and the championship, and the tradition behind it. Then he said something that the section of the crowd near the front row had been anticipating since the recognition moved through their rows 2 hours earlier. He said that for the trophy presentation, the Federation was honored to have a guest who had expressed genuine respect for Japanese martial arts, and who had traveled here not as a celebrity visitor, but as someone who considered himself a student of the discipline. He said the guest had agreed to present the championship trophy. He looked toward the front row. He said Bruce Lee's name. The reaction from 6,000 people was layered and immediate. The front rows, which had known for 2 hours, responded first. The rows behind them responded as recognition traveled, each section adding to the volume as it understood what was being said. By the time the sound reached the back of the building, it had built into something that had real physical presence, the kind of crowd noise that you feel as well as hear. Bruce stood from his front row seat, received the trophy from the Federation chairman, and walked to the competition mat. He stepped onto the mat and crossed it toward the center, where Yamamoto was standing with her coaches, and brought his hands together and bowed. The formal bow of someone who knows what this gesture means in this context. Yamamoto watched him bow. She had been watching since his name was announced, reading his movement the way she read everything that entered her competitive space. She was still in her competition gi, still breathing slightly hard from the final, and the expression she wore watching him cross the mat was the expression of someone making a rapid assessment. She had been a competitive judo practitioner for 21 years. She had an opinion about martial arts films and about how they represented what serious practitioners built, and that opinion had been forming since the first time she watched a martial arts film several years ago and recognized the gap between what was being shown and what her own training had produced. She stepped toward the announcement microphone at the mat's edge. She said, in Japanese, something that the translator near the front row rendered immediately in English for the foreign guests section. She said that she was grateful for the recognition of the championship, but that she wanted to say something before accepting the trophy. Then she said it in English herself. Clearly, having clearly prepared this, she said, "Judo is not a film. What I have built across 21 years of serious practice cannot be represented by what gets shown to audiences in commercial films about martial arts. And I will not accept my championship trophy from someone who has built a career on that kind of representation." She looked at Bruce directly. She said, "You film martial arts. You do not practice martial arts. There is a difference that I spend every day of my life honoring, and I will not have it crossed at my championship ceremony." 6,000 people went from the warmth of post-championship celebration to a different kind of silence in approximately 3 seconds. Bruce stood in the center of the mat holding the trophy, and his expression had not significantly changed. He looked at Yamamoto with the kind of attention that was his most consistent quality, complete and patient, and reading below the surface of what was being said. The Federation chairman had moved toward the center of the mat with the expression of a man who has organized this event for months and is watching it become something different from what was organized. Bruce said quietly to the Federation chairman, "May I have the microphone?" The chairman hesitated briefly and then provided it, because the situation had already moved past the point where hesitation would change its direction. Subscribe before the next section. What Bruce Lee says in the next 30 seconds changes the temperature of the entire Budokan, and if you miss it because you forgot to subscribe, that is a real loss. Bruce said, holding the microphone, with 6,000 people listening, "I want to respond to what was said." 6,000 people became very still. He said, "I started training when I was 13 years old. I studied under Ip Man, who this community knows. I have been developing and teaching my own martial arts system for 10 years, and I have students across 2 countries. What you see in my films is real technique. The filming of it is how it reaches the world. The technique itself came from real training over 20 years. He paused. "I am a martial artist who makes films. I understand why someone might look at that from the outside and make a different conclusion. I would rather demonstrate than argue." Yamamoto said, "Demonstrate what? A movie performance?" He said, "Show me what you mean by real." She said, "I will show you judo." He said, "Then show me." 6,000 people understood simultaneously what was being proposed, and the sound that understanding produced was enormous and immediate. The Federation chairman was saying several things quickly in Japanese, none of which were having any effect on the direction of events. Bruce looked at him. "It's all right," he said. The chairman said, "Mr. Lee, this is the Budokan. This is the Women's Judo World Championship." "I cannot allow," Bruce said. She asked a genuine question. "I'm answering it." He set the trophy down at the mat's edge, carefully, upright. He looked at Yamamoto. "Your terms," he said. Yamamoto said, "Judo rules. I use judo. You use whatever you use. The championship referee calls it." The championship referee, who had officiated all of tonight's matches and who had been watching this development with the specific professional stillness of someone maintaining neutrality in an unprecedented situation, looked at the Federation chairman. The chairman looked at 6,000 people who were waiting. He made the decision that event organizers make when a situation is past their management capacity, which was to establish the safest possible parameters. He told the referee to keep it clean and to stop it if it needed stopping. The referee acknowledged this and moved to the center of the mat. He established terms in Japanese and English. Exhibition format. Both competitors indicate understanding. He looked at both of them. Both nodded. They found their positions. Yamamoto settled into her judo stance, the stance that 21 years had built into her, grips ready, weight distributed on the balls of her feet, her posture, the posture of someone for whom this position was more natural than any other position her body occupied. She was a world champion in this stance, and 6,000 people who understood judo knew exactly what that meant. Bruce stood the way he always stood, the non-stance that was a stance, the readiness that looked like nothing specific. The referee indicated they could begin. Yamamoto moved. She moved with the controlled speed of someone who has been doing this since they were 7 years old, and for whom the motion was as automatic as breathing. She closed distance, her right hand reaching for his lapel and her left hand reaching for his sleeve, the two-handed grip that was the foundation of her throwing system, established in the first contact of almost every match she had ever won. Her right hand found his lapel, her left hand found his sleeve. And then, something happened that the judo practitioners in that building, people who understood what should follow from that grip position, had not expected to see. She threw him. She executed the throw as cleanly as she had executed anything tonight. The hip rotation loaded, the pull and lift coordinated, The technique complete and real, and powered by 21 years of development. It worked exactly the way it was supposed to work. Bruce went up and came down. He landed on the mat, with the specific sound of a human body meeting a judo mat, a sound that 6,000 people in the Budokan recognized, and that carried clearly to every section of the building. The crowd made a sound. It was the sound of 6,000 people who were shocked, not at the throw, which was expected, but at the fact that the throw had landed, that the man who had been moving in ways that implied he was going to avoid everything had instead been caught and thrown and was now on the mat. He was on the mat for 6 seconds. Not because he was hurt, he was on the mat because he was there, and those 6 seconds were 6 seconds of him lying on the mat doing something that nobody in the building initially understood, which was thinking, actually thinking. Running through what had just happened from the beginning, the specific quick technical analysis that his training had made automatic, understanding what she had done and how she had done it, and what it had required to accomplish. He had let the grip establish. He had not avoided it. He had been reading the throw's direction from the moment of contact, and he had made a decision, in the fraction of a second between her loading the hip and the throw completing, that the right response was not to counter, but to learn, to feel what the throw felt like from inside it, to understand, from the position of the person being thrown, what the technique actually was. 6 seconds on the mat, then he stood up. He came up from the mat with the easy motion of someone who has fallen many times and has no physical consequences to manage from this one, and he stood and looked at Yamamoto, and he was smiling. Not performing a smile, the genuine small smile of someone who has just learned something. 6,000 people had been completely silent for those 6 seconds. When he stood, and they saw the smile, the silence broke, and the sound that replaced it was confused and wondering, the sound of a crowd that doesn't have a category for what it just watched. Yamamoto looked at him. Her expression was the expression of someone who threw a world-class technique at an opponent and watched it land cleanly, and is now watching that opponent stand up from it, looking like the throw confirmed something he had suspected. She moved toward him again. Same approach, same grip attempt. He wasn't there this time. He had moved before her hands arrived, an angular step that took him out of her grip path, and as she adjusted her approach, his right hand touched her sleeve arm at the elbow, not gripping, touching, a contact that added almost nothing to the direction her own motion was already traveling. It was enough. Her balance shifted by a small amount that her body's automatic correction systems should have been able to manage. They couldn't manage it because the shift had come at the specific moment when her weight was already committed to a direction, and the small addition his touch provided was in the same direction rather than opposing it. She stumbled, not a throw. A stumble, 2 quick steps forward, catching herself before reaching the mat. She straightened. She turned. Her expression had moved from the professional assessment she had worn since the ceremony began into something more engaged and more complicated. She came again, modifying her approach based on what the last exchange had shown her, which was the mark of a serious competitor and which Bruce had been watching for. He moved inside her grip attempt this time, getting closer rather than further, into the space where her throwing system needed distance to function. From that inside position, he was too close for her techniques to complete their designed mechanics, and his left hand found her hip with a touch that used the rotation she was already loading and redirected it. She went down. Not a controlled stumble. Down. Her knee touched the mat, and she caught herself with her hand and was on all fours for a moment before pushing up, and the movement of coming up had an urgency in it that wasn't there when she first approached him. She came up with her eyes already on him. Her breathing had changed. Her expression had arrived somewhere past professional assessment and into something more personal. The Federation chairman was moving toward the mat center. The championship referee was already there. 2 of Yamamoto's coaches had come from the corner. This is the moment. Like this video right now. Not for any reason, except that you are watching the thing. This channel was built to tell, and it deserves that acknowledgement. Yamamoto came again. She came because she was a world champion with 21 years of practice, and she had just been put on the mat in a way she had not fully processed, and her body and her training were not prepared to accept that as the end of the exchange. She came with full commitment, everything she had, the throw that had won tonight's final and 43 of her previous championships, executing it with the speed and precision of someone performing at the absolute peak of what they had built. Bruce accepted the grip. He felt it establish, felt her load the hip, felt the mechanics engage, and in the fraction of a second between loading and executing, he did something that nobody in the Budokan had seen before, because it came from a different vocabulary entirely, from principles that Judo hadn't developed because Judo didn't need them. that existed in the system he had been building for 10 years from the accumulated understanding of everything he had studied. He yielded completely in the direction of the throw, giving her the resistance she wasn't expecting, and simultaneously redirected his own body around the throw's axis in a way that converted the throwing motion into a different geometry, arriving not where the throw was sending him, but at a position beside her, and from that position, with her own throwing motion still completing around the axis he had vacated, his hand found her shoulder and guided what was already in motion into the mat. She went down harder than she had intended to put him down. She landed flat, and the sound of it reached the back of the Budokan clearly. She lay there for a moment, not hurt, processing, the specific processing that happens when something has occurred that your 21 years of training did not prepare you for. She came up faster than he expected, which told him something about her and which he filed. She came up with the controlled fury of someone who has been on the mat twice and whose competitive instincts have completely taken over from the ceremonial context that produced this exchange. She came with Judo again, the grip, the throw, 3 different throws in quick succession, each one genuine, each one executed with the full capability that had produced 61 wins, each one finding the position it was designed for. He was not where they found him. He was moving through her throws, the way he had moved through everything all evening, finding the spaces the techniques left, redirecting the momentum she was generating, touching her at points of balance in ways that accumulated into consequences she couldn't prevent. The 4th throw he redirected completely. He took what she gave him and returned it in a direction she hadn't designed for, and she went up and came down in a way she had not chosen. She was on the mat again. Her coaches had both come through and were crossing the mat with urgent purpose. The Federation chairman was speaking into a separate microphone, trying to narrate the situation back towards something manageable. The championship referee was at the center of the mat, with both arms spread wide, the formal signal that the exchange was concluded. Yamamoto was on her feet before her coaches reached her. She did not go toward them, she went toward Bruce, who had started moving toward the mat's edge in the direction of the exit ropes. The security staff stationed at the corners of the mat were moving. Yamamoto was faster. She reached Bruce before the security staff reached her, and she reached for his arm, not to attack, to stop him, because she had something to say and was not prepared to let the situation conclude before she said it. He stopped, not because of the grip on his arm, which was present and real, because he heard what was underneath the grip, which was not aggression, but something with more weight and more difficulty in it. He turned. The security staff was around them now, 2 of them, maintaining a perimeter that everyone could see wasn't necessary, but that nobody was prepared to remove. Yamamoto looked at him. Her chest was moving with her breathing, the elevated breathing of someone who has been competing at maximum intensity for the last several minutes on top of a full championship evening. She said, in English, that was precise, despite the circumstances. What did you do on that last throw? He said. Which part? She said. The part where you gave me the grip and then weren't there when the throw completed. He said. I went with your throw's direction instead of against it. Then I moved around the axis you gave me, rather than along the line you intended. She absorbed this. She said, that's not in judo. He said, no. She said, where does it come from? He said, from understanding what the throw is doing mechanically and moving in relationship to the mechanics, rather than in relationship to the throw's intended result. She was quiet for a moment. The security staff maintained their positions. The Federation chairman was still speaking into his microphone, his voice carrying the specific quality of someone attempting to restore a situation to normalcy, while the situation is not cooperating. Yamamoto said, you let me throw you the first time. He said, yes. She said, why? He said, to understand what the throw felt like from inside it. I can't know a technique fully until I've been in it. She looked at him for a long moment. 6,000 people in the Budokan were watching this exchange with the specific focus of a crowd that has been through a championship final and a confrontation and an extraordinary exchange and is now watching something quieter and stranger and possibly more significant than any of it. She said, I said you had no standing here. He said yes. She said, I said your martial arts was fake. He said yes. She said I was wrong about both of those things. He said, you were working with what you had seen. What you had seen was incomplete. She said, I made those statements publicly. He said, yes. She said, in front of 6,000 people. He said, and now you're correcting them in front of 6,000 people. That's harder than the throw. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, harder than the throw. He said, yes. She said something in Japanese to her coaches who were nearby. One of them nodded and went to the mat's edge and came back with the championship trophy, which had been placed there at some point in the preceding exchange. She took it. She walked to the center of the mat. She picked up the announcement microphone. She spoke in Japanese first, clearly and without performance, and then she said it in English. She said, "I made a statement at the beginning of this ceremony about the man who was invited to present my trophy. I said he had no standing here. I said his martial arts was fake." She paused. The Budokan was completely quiet. "I was wrong. I said it in front of all of you, and I am correcting it in front of all of you, because the public correction matters as much as the public statement." She looked at Bruce. "What he does is real. I know this because I felt it. He let me throw him and landed smiling, and then showed me something I have not seen in 21 years of judo. That is not what a fake practitioner does. That is what a genuine one does." She held the trophy out toward him. He crossed the mat and took it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he turned toward her and held it out to her. She looked at it. She took it. 6,000 people responded with the warmth of people who have been through something together and have watched it resolve with honesty, and the warmth was genuine and full and lasted longer than the championship applause had lasted. Backstage, in the corridor outside the competition area, Yamamoto found Bruce before he left the building. She was still in her gi. She was carrying her championship trophy in one arm. She said, "The throw I used, the first time, you felt something during it." He said, "Your right hip engages slightly before the left during the load. You favor the right side in your power generation. It's small, but it creates a predictable rotation pattern." She said, "You felt that during the throw." He said, "Yes. It was the most direct way to understand it." She said, "That's why you let me throw you." He said, "I needed to feel it from inside to understand it fully. Watching from outside tells you what the technique does. Being inside it tells you how it does it." She absorbed this. She said, 21 years of judo and I've never thought about information gathering that way." He said, "Judo gives you different information. Your system has refined what it needs to refine for what judo is. This is something from a different framework." She said, "Tell me more about the last throw." "The one you did," he told her. Standing in the Budokan corridor under fluorescent lights, he walked through the mechanics of what he had done. The yield that converted her throwing motion into a different axis, the movement around that axis rather than along the intended line, the position it created, and why. He explained it in terms that were specific and practical, and that engaged directly with judo's own vocabulary of balance and momentum and point of no return. She listened with the focused attention she gave everything. She asked 4 specific questions. He answered all 4. She said, "That principle, moving around the axis rather than along the intended line, is that something I can incorporate into judo?" He said, "Parts of it. The principle is general. The application is specific to what you're doing." She said, "I want to work on it." He said, "It will take time." She said, "I know what takes time." He said, "Yes, I saw that in how you fight." She said, "Come to my dojo. I train in the morning." He said, "I leave Tokyo in 2 days." She said, "Tomorrow morning." He said, "Then yes." She looked at him. "I treated you badly tonight." He said, "You said what you believed." She said, "I believed something incomplete." He said, "Most of it was right. The film representation issue is real. The specific conclusion about me was what was incomplete." She said, "That distinction matters." He said, "It does." She said, "I should have made the distinction before I spoke publicly." He said, "Yes, but you made it publicly afterward. That corrects it." She was quiet for a moment, then she brought her hands together and bowed. The formal bow, held for a full count, the bow of a senior practitioner, acknowledging something real. He returned it completely. When he straightened, he said, "The right hip in your throw. It's a very small thing. Most people couldn't see it." She said, "But you could." He said, "I was looking for it." She said, "Why were you looking before I even threw?" He said, "I'm always looking, for everyone. It's automatic after enough years." She said, "How many years?" He said, 20, roughly. She said, "Same as me." He said, "Roughly." She almost smiled. Then she said, "Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. I'll have someone meet you at the gate." He said, "I'll be there." She went back into the building. He went toward the exit. The corridor was quiet after they both left it, the way corridors are quiet after something has passed through them, holding no trace of what happened there except in the accounts of the people who were present and the training that one of them would undertake the following morning at 7 o'clock. He was there at 7. She was already on the mat when he arrived, because she was always already on the mat when anyone arrived, which was a consistent quality that her students described as the most reliable fact about her. They trained for 3 hours. Not a lesson where one person taught and one person learned, but the specific exchange that happens between 2 serious practitioners who have different vocabularies for the same underlying language and are trying to find where those vocabularies connect. He showed her the axis principle in more detail. She showed him the specific mechanics of her most complex throw, walking him through it from her own side of it. He went through it again, willingly, feeling the mechanics from the inside, and came up with specific questions about the weight transfer at the point of no return. The 3 hours had the quality of time spent on something genuinely important, unhurried and complete. When they finished, she said, "This is what I thought wasn't here." He said, "The genuine exchange." She said, "Between real practitioners." He said, "Yes." She said, "I almost prevented it." He said, "You didn't." She said, "I came close." He said, "Yes, but the willingness to correct yourself publicly is rare. It took something to do that." She said, "It took being thrown." He said, "Sometimes that's what it takes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you didn't avoid the first throw." He said, "So am I." She said, "Most people would have." He said, "Most people aren't trying to understand what they're being thrown by." She looked at him. "That's the difference." He said, "That's most of it." She kept competing for 4 more years after Tokyo. She won 2 more world championships. The people who watched her through that period noted something that they described in different ways, but that pointed consistently at the same quality: an adaptability in her work that hadn't been as pronounced before, a willingness to move around problems rather than through them, a flexibility that hadn't cost her any power but had added something to what the power could accomplish. She retired undefeated from world championship competition and moved into coaching and eventually into running the dojo she had trained in since she was a child, which under her direction became one of the most respected judo schools in Japan. Her students described her teaching the way students describe teaching that has been shaped by something the teacher carries deeply. They said she expected genuine work and had genuine patience for the time genuine work required, and that the combination was unusual enough that people came from across the country to train with her. When students were thrown repeatedly and became frustrated, she told them that being thrown was information. She said that if you were only interested in not being thrown, you were limiting what the mat could teach you. She said the willingness to land and get up and keep paying attention was where the real development lived, not in the techniques you executed, but in the attention you maintained through everything that happened to you. She said this in different words to different students at different times, but the core of it was always the same thing, and the students who knew her long enough understood that it wasn't general teaching wisdom. It came from somewhere specific. She never said publicly where it came from. The students who asked got the answer that it came from experience, which was true. What the experience was, and who had shown her what being on the mat could teach you, she kept for herself. Some lessons are for the person who learned them and the person who taught them. Not because they need to be hidden, but because they are complete as they are. The corridor conversation was complete, the 3-hour morning was complete, the championship evening was complete, beginning with the bow that was refused and ending with the bow that was given fully. The Budokan was full that night in Tokyo. 6,000 people who came for a championship and watched something larger than that, something that started as a ceremony and became a confrontation, and became an exchange, and then became a conversation that continued the next morning, with nobody watching. That is what real encounters produce, not the visible part. The training that the visible part makes possible, in gyms and early mornings and corridors, patient and honest and permanent. Subscribe if this story was worth your time. Tell me in the comments, what is the most important thing you've learned from something that knocked you down? I'll read every single one.